real quick. Okay. Alrighty, I apologize for that short delay. Welcome everybody back to our second day together in my final presentation, but please note that this is a workshop. And I don't know about you, but in my world, my definition of a workshop is different than a presentation. I want this really to be more interactive. Normally what I would do is give you a problem and break you up into some small groups and have you solve it and then combine and compare solutions. But since this is such a small group to begin with, I think we're just going to do it as one group, just sort of visually. So this is an extension of the presentations that I did yesterday, in particular the commercializing disruptive medical technologies in an evolutionary world. The reality of it is we can beat up on the regulatory environment as much as we want to, but although it might change in the future, we have to deal with what we have right now. So I don't like to be a complainer. I don't like to be the regulatory police telling people what they cannot do. Instead, what I like to do is figure out ways to make whatever we want to do, figure out ways to make them happen. And one of the challenges when we develop truly new or novel products and bring them to market in an environment, a regulatory environment that is not designed to do that, how exactly do we do that? So one of the questions that sometimes people ask me is, what's the best way to learn regulatory affairs? Of course, you can read a book, you can read the regulation, although I would not recommend that to my worst enemies. You can check out the internet, you can attend courses, you can attend conferences like this. There are a litany of ways that you can learn regulatory affairs, but I would suggest that the best way to learn regulatory affairs is simply to keep an eye open to the products that are coming to the market, either here in the United States or whatever part of the world that you live in. In other words, and I'm from the US, so I'm just going to use the US as an example. So when FDA approves or clears a product that I think is interesting, for whatever reason interesting might mean, look at how that product was brought to market. What did they do in order to bring that product to market? But don't stop there. You also have to ask yourself the question, what other ways could they have brought this product onto the market but didn't? And why did they not? Right? This is, to dovetail on the topic of regulatory intelligence yesterday. It's very easy to look at what somebody did. What's much more of a challenge is to look at what they didn't do and why they didn't do it. Right? Most people don't talk about that or write about that. Okay? So to that end, I want to share with you a few examples of case studies. I just sort of picked them from different areas of medicine, one from orthopedics, one from cardiology, and one from ophthalmology. And what I'm hoping to do is go through at least two, perhaps all three of these as a group activity. And you tell me, we'll have a discussion, just like if we were bringing one of these products onto the market in our company. What would we do in order to bring this particular product onto the market? And then, and finally, oncology. And by the way, I picked my ophthalmology example because of our friend the ophthalmologist that was here yesterday, who interestingly is not back here today, so we'll see. And then I'll wrap up with a couple of final thoughts. So let's first talk about orthopedics. So one of the topics that I talked a little bit about yesterday is 3D printing. And personalized medicine. So obviously, as we all know, everybody is different, but in the medical device world, all of our medical devices are basically the same. The question is, why? Does that make sense? In biology, the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't usually work. So how about a personalized approach to, in this particular case, a knee implant? And I would suggest, I'm going to show you a short video from the news recently on this, that you pay attention, because I do want to make this interactive, and as a part-time teacher myself, I will call on people Okay, so I want you to think about, if you were developing this particular technology in your company, how would you bring it onto the market?
Sounds like science fiction, but Dr. Malika Marshall shows us a local company that's using 3D printing to rebuild knees.
Live from the Channel 4 studios in Boston, WBZ News at 11 starts right now.
Okay, this sounds like science fiction, but it is fact.
A 3D knee that's offering hope to millions of Americans who need replacement surgery. As Dr. Malika Marshall shows us, it's custom made by a local company.
We see a lot of knee injuries in here.
Overused joints just wearing out. Personal trainer Jeff Dosdell of Bodyscapes in Wellesley sees it all the time.
They've got arthritis, they've got overuse injuries, and the knees start to wear out on you.
Even for some people in their 30s and 40s, and a lot of folks end up having surgery.
Knee replacement is the most common joint replacement worldwide,
providing huge relief most of the time. Dr. Philip Lang, co-founder of Conformis, a medical device company in Bedford, says about a quarter of patients aren't happy with their results.
They have pain, they have limited range of motion, the knee doesn't feel natural.
So Conformis is changing that. Conformis is the only company in the world that is making knee replacement implants that are completely tailored to each individual patient. Using CT imaging, special computer software, and 3D printer technology, scientists produce a unique knee implant and customized surgical instruments designed for one patient and only that patient.
This fits exactly to your patient. It brings back your individual knee, the shape of your knee, the curvatures of your knee, and so as such it should move like a normal knee.
No two knees are the same, and off-the-shelf implants come in a limited number of sizes. And a bad fit, says orthopedic surgeon Dr. Joseph Zarnecki, can cause more bleeding and swelling.
I've seen more with the Conformis knee that is a quicker return to range of motion. There doesn't tend to be as much swelling and not as much pain in the hospital because this is matched to their bone. Hi, Mary. How are you doing?
Good. Good.
Mary Coles of Westminster had a traditional knee replacement back in 2001 and a Conformis implant in her other knee just 3 months ago. She says there's no comparison.
Time-wise in the hospital was less time. My physical therapy was much easier. I got movement so much faster. If I didn't see the scar on it, I would assume that it's my normal knee.
The Conformis implants are covered by insurance and generally aren't more expensive. The company says they plan to make other joints like shoulders and hips, and they're the first company to receive FDA approval for 3D printing in metal. I'm Dr. Malika Marshall, WBZ News.
Okay, so you got the idea. One of the points I tried to make yesterday is, to me, personalized medicine is personalized medicine. Whether we're talking about personalized medicine of a medical device like this, or we're talking about personalized medicine of a drug, as I talked about yesterday afternoon, at the end of the day, it's exactly the same thing. And on a personal note, I think in terms of a future regulatory pathway, we do not need a separate regulatory pathway for medical devices and for drugs. Instead, I think that would be a disadvantage. What we need is a common regulatory pathway for all personalized medicine, whether it's a device or a drug. But that's a topic of a different discussion because we don't have that yet. So the question is, how would we bring this particular product onto the market? I said yesterday, in my opinion, the 510K, which is the most commonly used pathway in the medical device universe, doesn't make sense. But we don't have a better option for right now anyway. So this company and others like it are not going to want to wait around for 5 years or 10 years until we figure out an appropriate regulatory pathway. We want to bring it onto the market now. How do we do that? What do we do? This is supposed to be a regulatory conference. Let's dig into the regulatory issues here and talk about what's involved in bringing a product like this, in this particular case, a 3D printed knee, to the market. Anybody want to start us off, or where would you begin? Please. Can you speak up a little bit? Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. And certainly international regulatory strategy is an important consideration. But because we have limited time, and because we're here in the United States, let's just assume that we're talking about bringing it onto the market here. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, okay. Interesting approach. Anybody else? Yes? What do you mean by that? The problem with that, with all due respect, is if everybody felt that way, we'd still be living in caves. Somebody's got to be the first, right? Okay. Yeah, which to me is right, which to me is a huge advantage. In other words, as I talked a tiny bit about yesterday, I love to work in areas where the regulation is either very vague or better, where there's no regulation whatsoever. Because, first of all, it gives me, as I said yesterday, the opportunity to get FDA to think the way I want them to think. That's number one. But number two, this gets into what I call competitive regulatory strategy. Let me go off on a little bit of a tangent of an article that just came out this month in the Journal of Medical Device Regulation on competitive regulatory strategy. To most people that have heard that phrase, how many of you have heard this, competitive regulatory strategy? So to most people who have heard this phrase, it means, how did your competitor get their drug or their device on the market before you? That is not what competitive regulatory strategy means to me. That's just simply playing follow the leader. And again, with all due respect, any monkey can do that. To me, competitive regulatory strategy means something much more. How can I, again, I'm going to use a medical device as an example here in the United States. Very easy to get a device onto the market here in the US. I do it all the time. The challenge is, how do we get our medical device on the market and at the same time create a barrier to entry to our competition? In other words, make it more difficult for our competitors to follow in our footsteps. The simple reality is, the simple reality is that the vast majority of folks, they look at the regulatory process as nothing more than a burden, a set of hoops that you have to jump through in order to get your product onto the market. And I don't see it that way at all. If I have to jump through these hoops, but what can I do to position these hoops to make it more difficult for my competitors to jump through these hoops after me? And one of the huge advantages in my world of being first to market is not only do you get the opportunity. That's right. Well, but medicine is a business. So one of the huge advantages of being first to market in a truly new or novel area is not simply getting your product on the market and getting, market penetration and all those things, that's obvious. But actually make it more difficult for your competition to follow in your footsteps. There's a litany of ways that we can do that, but some subtle, some not so subtle. I don't have time to get into those. But how do we get this onto the market? I really want to get into the regulatory minutia here, because this is supposed to be a regulatory conference. And with all due respect, I haven't heard a lot about specific, how do you get a product, drug, a device, whatever it is, on the market? So how do we do that? Well, that's a legal thing. Yeah, you might do a trademark, you might do some intellectual property or whatever, but that's really not regulatory. Yeah, but again, let's focus on the regulatory. So, for example, what would be the optimal regulatory pathway here in the United States to get this onto the market? What would be I shouldn't say the optimal, what would be the least burdensome? 510K. All right, so I talked a little bit about the 510K yesterday. What are the two most important parts of the 510K? Yeah, that's what do we call that in the regulatory vernacular? Substantial equivalence. So one of the two most important parts of a 510K submission is your substantial equivalence argument. We'll come back to that in a second. The other one is what? Risk mitigation. Your risk mitigation strategy. Which, by the way, risk mitigation in a design control sense is not the same as risk mitigation in a regulatory submission sense. There is overlap, but they are not carbon copies of one another. So for the sake of time, I don't want to talk about risk in this kind of a product, although it is pretty easy to mitigate. How do we build a substantial equivalence argument for a device like this when no other device like this exists? What is the regulatory logic? With all due respect, it drives me nuts when people begin with the regulation. Because, in my opinion, that is the totally wrong approach. We should begin with the engineering and the pathophysiology first, and then let the regulation follow. So, from an engineering or a pathophysiology perspective, is this really new? No, it's not new. Why not? So you're going in the right direction. Who can take that a half a step further? The device itself is not new. We've been doing knee implants for decades. What is new? What kind of technology? What the technology of the implant? Perhaps, but let's assume that the technology of the implant is the same. Say it again. Personalizing, okay, that's new, but I can mitigate that by saying we manufacture knee implants in various sizes, and we pick the closest size to match that particular patient. So that's personalizing. This is personalizing a little bit closer. That's the new part. It's the manufacturing process that's new. Well, so yeah, that's what I was trying to be more specific, because technology is a little nebulous, right? So it's so maybe perhaps we can call it the manufacturing technology. So therefore, do we have to put much emphasis on the device? No. That's exactly right. So what is the crux to this? For example, many of you are probably saying we need to do clinical trials on this. How could we argue a clinical trial like this, a clinical trial for a product like this is totally necessary, is totally unnecessary? What would be the regulatory logic? Remember, as I said yesterday, what is most important in regulation, whether it's at FDA or somewhere else, is not what you say, but your ability to defend it. So if I walk into FDA and I say, I would never ask. I mean, somebody shoot me if I were to go to FDA and say, hey, this is our product. Do you think we should do a clinical trial? Of course they're going to say yes, and we think you should use 5 million people, right? I'm being facetious. I would walk into FDA or EU or Health Canada or whatever and say, a clinical trial for this product is not warranted, is not necessary, and here's why. What would be the explanation? No. Good guess, but no. What is the regulatory? Remember, as I said yesterday, I'm trying to teach you how to think, not what to think. It's not a new product, that is, it's not a new device, but what is new? The manufacturing. So if we can show that the product that we print is substantially equivalent to the product that we manufacture in the conventional way, in other words, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, right? Therefore, the only thing that we have to validate in this product in the 510K is what? The manufacturing process. No clinical data whatsoever. The manufacturing process, the regulation will never tell you any of this. It's the regulatory logic that's important. Make sense? Again, with all due respect, and I hear people do this all the time, the first thing they want to do is they want to consult the regulation. What does the regulation tell me to do? I don't want to follow regulation blindly. I don't want to be told what to do like a 2-year-old child. I want to do what makes sense. That's exactly right. And again, just to recap, because I want to go on to another example, just to recap, the logic here is that as long as that I can show the device that I'm making in this new manufacturing method is the same as the device that I made in the old manufacturing method, at the end of the day, I get to the same place. So what difference does it make how I get there? That's the regulatory logic. Does it make sense? Well, for the sake of this simple discussion, the short answer is no. But for the sake of this simple discussion, let's assume that it is. I'm trying to make this as simple as I can. But yep. 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 Yeah, but see, here's how I handle this. In the U.S., some people use the phrase an FDA-friendly material. An FDA-friendly material is just code speak for a material that we have a long history with and using in medical products. Companies, as a general rule, will prefer to use an FDA-friendly material as opposed to a new... I'm sorry? OTC? Over the counter? Yeah, no. I'm talking about even in a permanent implant. This has nothing to do with over-the-counter or prescription. Okay, so an FDA-friendly material is an advantage from a regulatory perspective because we don't have to do anything. We point to the history of that material and say, hey, we've been using this for a long time. We've been using it in similar parts of the body, yada, yada, yada. So my advice to the company would be to use an FDA-friendly material if we can. But when it comes to 3D printing, that's a little bit of a challenge. So the material piece is actually a pretty easy thing to handle. Yeah. Yeah, I get a sense that, again, for the sake of time, you're asking some great questions, but I really... No, please don't apologize for asking questions. Never apologize for asking questions. But because this is a regulatory conference and because we have such limited time, I really want to focus on the regulatory issues here as much as we can. Okay, so let's go on to another example. This particular one from cardio. How are we doing on time? We got 10 minutes. Okay, you know what? Then I'm going to go to this last one from oncology, because I think this is going to resonate with some of you a little bit more. So here's a product actually that's under development. And by the way, again, coming back to your discussion of regulatory intelligence, how do you do regulatory intelligence on a product that's not even on the market yet, that's under development? That's my favorite kind of regulatory intelligence to do, because there is nothing in the literature that will tell you how it was done. So here's a product. What is this thing? Well, this is basically a device or a combination product about the size of a grain of rice. It's implanted in a tumor. So this is, here we go. This is a tumor here, and this is our little device / combination product inside of it. Okay, so why do we put it in there? Because it's designed to carry a whole bunch of different drugs, perhaps 30 or more different drugs, that we can then deliver into that tumor, in part to determine which drug or which combination of drugs, as you talked about before, are the most effective for that particular patient's tumor. This is personalized medicine of medical devices. Once again, I've been saying for years, so many people think of personalized medicine or pharmacogenomics in terms of drugs. But some of my favorite examples of personalized medicine, like 3D printing and like this, involve medical devices. The goal here is to eliminate the guesswork in choosing an appropriate cancer treatment. In other words, we can then pick a drug or perhaps a combination of drugs that works best in that patient. So we're not talking about a computational model. We're not talking about an animal model. We're not even talking about a clinical trial. Well, in a sense, we are talking about a clinical trial. It's a clinical trial of one patient. In other words, we're putting in the one patient all of the different therapies that we have to kind of see which one sticks, which one works, so to speak. Does that make sense? So, how would you bring this onto the market? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I understand your point, and if we had more, we could go into it in much more detail, but I'll just make one quick comment. When I hear a word like rigorous, right away in the back of my mind, I'm hearing ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching. In other words, I'm thinking more time, more money, and my job, let me just be very frank, my job is to help the company get the product onto the market today. Not in a year, not in 5 years, not in 1,000 years. We can quibble all we want, we can complain all we want. The regulatory environment is not designed for this kind of stuff, which it isn't. But at the end of the day, this is the world in which we live. So how do we get the product onto the market today or as soon as possible, right? And again, because this is a regulatory conference, I really want to focus on the regulatory issues. So just to sort of prime the pump, I want to go through a couple of questions to throw out to you for discussion. Pardon me. So first is, as I said, how would you bring this product onto the market? Is there regulatory precedent? Well, there's nothing exactly like it on the market. But I would argue it's very similar to a number of other products that we already have. Go ahead. A preloaded syringe. Yeah, a preloaded syringe, a drug-eluting stent, a transdermal patch. These are all combination products, but let's dig into this a tiny bit further. Anybody know, I think I may have mentioned this the other day, anybody know what PMOA stands for? Well, it's actually, it's not just FDA. A number of other countries around the world have adopted the same phrase, much to my chagrin, because I think it's terrible, but that's a different issue. PMOA is primary mode of action. And in essence, what it means, and this is very important in combination products. Remember, as I said yesterday, a combination product is not just a device or a drug or a biologic, but a combination of two, sometimes even all three of those things. This is clearly a combination product. It's a combination of a device and one, or in this case, perhaps as many as 30 or more different drugs. So it's clearly a combination product. So because our regulatory environment was not designed to handle these kinds of products, what we did was we created a concept called primary mode of action, which basically says, what is the most important job, or let me say it this way, how does this product accomplish its most important function? In other words, if its most important function is mechanical, like a drug-eluting stent, then it's primarily regulated as a medical device. If its primary function is accomplished pharmacologically, like a transdermal patch, for example, then it's primarily regulated as a drug. If its primary function, its primary task is accomplished by a biologic, then it's regulated as a biologic by CBER, primarily, okay? So what would be the PMOA of a product like this? Because the very first question that you have to ask yourself when you're developing a product like this, when you're trying to bring a product like this to the market, is how is it primarily going to be regulated? Is it going to be primarily regulated as a medical device or as a drug? Because if you can't answer that question, then you might as well not go any further. Because the pathway, we don't have time to go into this, but the pathway for devices, as I hope you all know, is drastically different than the pathway for drugs, right? Now, given a choice between bringing this kind of a product onto the market as a drug or as a medical device primarily, what do you think the company is going to choose? A device. It's a no-brainer. If you spend more than a nanosecond thinking about that question, you're overthinking the question. because it is just so much easier to bring this onto the market primarily as a device than as a drug. But the question, the issue becomes, it's not what you think that's important. It's not what I think that's important. With all due respect, not what FDA thinks that's important. I could care less what FDA thinks. It's what you can sell. It's what you can convince people of. So if you were to walk into the agency and say, this is the product that we're working on, and it is primarily a medical device, it should be regulated primarily as a medical device, what would be the regulatory logic in order to do that? Well, let's just, okay, so instead of talking about 510K or PMA or something like that, let's just focus on making the PMOA argument first, because that has to come first. So what would be the PMOA argument as a hint? And this is exactly the logic that we used back in 2001 and 2 when we brought the first drug-eluting stent onto the market in the U.S. In the interest of full disclosure, I was one of the principal architects for Cordis's regulatory strategy when we did bring the first drug-eluting stent onto the market in the U.S. a little over a decade ago. We brought it primarily as a device. Primarily as a device. It's regulated to this day primarily as a device. So as a hint, consider this next question. Are we using existing drugs or new drugs? I'll give you a hint, as I said a moment ago, referring to one of the precedents here, the drug-eluting stent. If you know something about drug-eluting stents, we are using, even today in 2015, existing drugs or derivatives of existing drugs on our drug-eluting stent. Let's be clear, those were absolutely not the best drug choices. Absolutely not. Why did we do it? Simple. Because we wanted to keep the DES primarily as a medical device. If we were to put a new drug on the drug-eluting stent, how do you think that would be easier or more difficult to sell the risk mitigation strategy treating this as a device or a drug? It would be much more difficult. Much more difficult. So, assuming for the sake of time, we're putting a hodgepodge of different drugs in this device, and quite frankly, I don't care what those drugs are, as long as they are existing drugs, and as long as they have been used for the same indication in the past, and ideally, if they've been delivered in the same way. In other words, if we deliver them via, for example, a catheter or a needle, and we inject them right into the tumor, that would be the absolute easiest from a regulatory perspective to do it. Why? Because if, let's, for the sake of discussion, say that we put one or more drugs into this implantable device that previously they were injected via catheter, syringe, something like that, directly into the tumor. What would be the regulatory logic to bring this particular product onto the market? It would be a no-brainer. It would be so easy. Because all I would do is I would say, hey, I'm changing my route of administration. Instead of using a needle or a catheter, I'm putting the drug into the device and putting the device into the tumor, but at the end of the day, the same drug is getting to the same place at the same rate, the same concentration, yada, yada, yada. Now, it becomes a tiny bit more of a challenge because, as you know, in oncology, we don't usually deliver drugs locally. We usually deliver them systemically, which is a problem. Most drugs we do not want to deliver systemically, but I won't get into that. So if we take drugs, for example, that in the past have been delivered systemically, and now we're going to deliver them locally, how do I use regulatory logic to mitigate the amount of benchtop testing, animal testing, clinical testing to do? I don't want to have to do any more testing than I absolutely need to. And there's so much that I can mitigate just simply based on logic. How would I do that? I would simply say that in the past, we've been using this same drug for the same indication systemically, and one of the things that we've had to worry about is side effects. But in this particular scenario, I'm delivering a much smaller quantity of the drug right to the place of the body where I need it, maximizing the concentration right there, and at the same time, minimizing it everywhere else. And if I can show at the end of the day that the concentration of the drug in the tumor when it's delivered locally is the same as the concentration of the tumor, of the drug in the tumor when it's delivered systemically, do I have to do any clinical testing? Zero. You see the power of the regulatory logic? It's an extraordinarily powerful approach that practically very, very few people use. Because so many people, with all due respect, they're focused on what the regulation says. So to wrap this up, because I'm out of time, are there other uses for similar technologies? In other words, as I talked a little bit about yesterday, this is truly a platform technology. We don't have to use it just for tumors and oncology. As you can imagine, we can use the same idea for lots and lots of different things. And so one of the challenges becomes is if we can use a platform technology for many different things, which thing do we go after first? The one thing that we go after first is not the one that has the biggest market. It's the one that has the lowest regulatory burden. Because the idea is if we get this product onto the market for the indication that has the lowest regulatory burden, we can always do a label expansion later to go after other indications. And again, as a general rule, I don't have time to get into why, but label expansions, almost by definition, are much easier to do than to bring a new product onto the market for the first time. That's sort of regulatory 101, okay? How does the delivery system impact the regulatory path? Again, I talked about this already a tiny bit. So if in the past we've been using a drug that's injected directly into the tumor, all we're doing is we're changing the delivery system. In other words, we're changing from one particular form of syringe to another. But if we're going from systemic to local, that's a little more of a change. It's not an unsolvable problem by any means, but it's a little more of a change. Somebody mentioned materials earlier. This is a topic of a whole different discussion. But what if we use a bioabsorbable material? In other words, once the drug goes away, the device goes away. Well, once again, that is eminently doable, but from a regulatory perspective, that makes things much more messy. Not impossible, but much more messy. And you know, there are other issues as well. But bottom line, in the very short period of time that we had, and thank you to everybody that participated, I hope you appreciate the power of the regulatory logic approach. So just to wrap this up, I love this ad. If we think that we can do it, I really believe that. I really believe nothing is impossible. Albert Einstein, very smart guy, said, imagination is more important than knowledge. For while knowledge points to all there is, imagination points to all that can be. I really believe that. I really hope in the presentation today, as well as mine yesterday, I did much more than just give you some knowledge about medicine and technology and regulation. I've sparked your imagination a little bit, because Einstein also said, logic will get you from A to B, but imagination can take you anywhere. What's wrong with applying a little imagination in the regulatory world? Most people do not do that, but they're missing a huge opportunity. And here's a quote from somebody from my part of the world who said, perhaps imagination is only intelligence having fun. I'm not standing up here claiming to be intelligent, just ask my wife. But on the other hand, I do like to have fun. So what's wrong with having a little fun? Final thought, I shared this with you yesterday. Discovery is seeing what everybody else is seeing and thinking what nobody else has thought. So with all due respect, if you look at a product that I just showed you and see in it something new that nobody else has seen before, like what's the relationship here between that and the drug, the syringe or the transdermal patch, that's a very good skill to have, because a lot of people don't have that skill. Or if you put it another way, it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. It's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. And finally, hopefully I've changed your perspective, turned your world upside down a little bit. As Thomas Jefferson said, a little revolution now and again is a good thing, including in the regulatory world. We really need that. So if you want a copy of any of my handouts, give me your business card or connect with me on LinkedIn. If we have time for any more questions, I'm happy to do so. Otherwise, we'll continue on to our next presenter. Oh, okay. Okay. So any quick questions before we break? That particular one, let me just say it this way. So I my fingers in a lot of different intellectual property, but I work really hard to keep my name off the IP. So I'm being a bit of a politician. I'm not answering the question that you asked. I'm answering the question that I wanted to answer. Good question. Good question. You're welcome. Well, thank you. No. That's not my intent. Please don't misunderstand. That's not, what I am trying to do is I am trying to raise the bar. Okay. I mean, I don't mean to put anybody else down by any means, but I am trying to raise the bar. And I